Let's turn now to Jonathan Merritt, senior columnist at the Religion News Service. Jonathan, the key in this decision is that the justices, and pretty much everybody seems to say, hey, this is a Christian business. You say you cannot call your business Christian when arguing before the court, then set aside Christian values when you're placing a bulk order for cheap wind chimes via China. They're not a Christian business to you.
Well, I'm not sure that any business can be considered a Christian business, particularly if you're an evangelical Christian. You consider the Bible to be your sort of principal resource for life and practice. The Bible only uses the term Christian in one way. It applies to individuals. It doesn't apply to governments. It doesn't apply to corporations. So the term is theologically nonsensical. It's not actually a thing for evangelical Christians. I think they're using the term because it's politically expedient, but it's really theological nonsense for evangelical Christians.
Well, and I think you've hit on the piece of this that doesn't make a lot of sense to folks, which is this idea that a corporation can hold and exercise religious beliefs. And as I was reading through the opinions here, it struck me that there's not a lot of legal reasoning in place to, they say, oh, well, logically it's not going to apply to publicly traded corporations. But it doesn't seem to me that once you've opened that door to allowing for-profit corporations to hold religious beliefs, that you can really keep it from going that next step to publicly traded larger corporations.
Well, I think we still have a mess, even if it doesn't expand to public companies. And so we have to really ask what is next. I think the question that we have to ask here is not how did the court rule, but what does it really mean? And that's something that I think it's going to take some time to sort out. We've already mentioned in the setup here that you could have Jehovah's Witnesses who do not believe in blood transfusions saying we want to cover health care, but we're not going to cover blood transfusions. What about evangelicals who don't believe that medical marijuana is moral? Should they just exempt out of that? Even more serious, I think, would be Christian scientists who don't believe in health care at all. So do they get to just opt out of health care altogether? I think these are questions that we're going to see coming down the pike really soon, and I'm not sure exactly how the court will rule on some of those things.
Yeah, well, we keep saying this is another exemption because there have been others before this under the Affordable Care Act, like businesses with 50 employees or less, like undocumented immigrants or certain religious sects and churches. It's a little bit unfair to have an exemption for some and not all. Do you think that this ruling would have come down differently had there not already been a precedent for it?
You know, I don't know. I'm not a legal expert. I'm a religion writer, so it's maybe a little bit above my pay grade. I will say this. I think you have to place this in appropriate context, which is we are now in a culture-wide debate about the limits of religious liberties. You've seen it this year. You had the Supreme Court refuse to hear the case of the photographer in New Mexico who said, I'm not going to shoot a same-sex wedding. You had it in the anti-gay discrimination laws that came in places like Arizona, Missouri, kicked down the road in places like Mississippi and Georgia. And so I think we're seeing now, we know that there are limits to religious liberty, that the ocean of religious liberty stops at the shoreline of the common good. But I think in the years coming forward, we're going to have to determine as a society exactly where that shore is.
Very interesting. The cycle, of course, does keep a lawyer on retainer because sometimes I get in trouble. You know how it is. Ari, what's your take on today's decision?
I'm going to get into your case in a minute, Ture.
Thank you.
I think when you look at this case and try to figure out what is going on and does a corporation have a soul, these kind of questions, Justice Alito has a line here that is the best representation of the majority opinion. Let's look at that. He says, when rights, whether constitutional or statutory, are extended to corporations, the purpose is to protect the rights of people. And that, I think, is what the conservatives are arguing here, and that is their best argument. In the same way that a newspaper might be organized as a corporation, but retains First Amendment protections not only at the individual level, but at the corporate form. That's the best argument. What's new today, what's different today, is that we're seeing this not in the area of traditional speech itself and content, what we might call in business, but in religion, which gets way weirder. And here's how Justice Ginsburg describes that in her very passionate dissent. She said, until this litigation, basically until today, no decision of this court recognized a for-profit corporation's qualification for a religious exemption from a generally applicable law. The absence of such precedent is just what one would expect, for the exercise of religion is characteristic of natural persons, not artificial legal entities. And that's why you don't have to be a lawyer to say it's weird that this corporation that gets granted certain benefits to make money now has some core religious identity. And that goes to another point. You said you're not a lawyer and this might be above your pay grade. I think lawyers are always below the pay grade of God, so we'll keep you up high. But this decision is not only about law, and it's certainly not only about God. This decision fundamentally is about a vision of capitalism. And when we talk about this as religious freedom, we are forgetting the fact that after this decision, the majority of people don't have more religious freedom rights because the majority of people don't own companies. Right? This entire thing is a 1% decision, and it's done very well from a legally or argumentative perspective that they've made it sound like it's all about religious freedom. It's not. It's about more rights for people who run companies. If you don't run a company, you didn't get anything out of this decision today. And the people who do now are going to have more sway, putting their beliefs over their employees. Whether or not you think that's a bad thing, I would argue depends a lot more on your view of labor and capitalism than of God.
Yeah, and in that way, it links very closely with the other decision coming out of the Supreme Court today. The Supreme Court often takes the side of large employers, it would seem, rights over the little guy. All right, Jonathan Merritt and Ari Melber, thank you so much.
Thanks, Crystal. It's great to be here.
Hey, we like having you at the table, Ari.
Yeah.